So what we're going to do is look at a number of different sections as we go through this afternoon. I'm going to take you through some understanding of around what we mean when we talk about stress and the trauma response. What are adverse childhood experiences? Looking at how in Wales we've taken particular care to study what they are and think about exposure and prevalence, which is useful for you to know in terms of background and understanding of what we're going to be talking about in the second part. An understanding of the risk that then brings to the life course, not just to children, but to young adults and to adults. And you can see then the link between what happens in your childhood and how that extends into adult life. Then looking at how we prevent, mitigate and tackle adverse childhood experiences, and in particular for our purposes, those that we have understood a bit more about in the asylum seeking and refugee populations. So I'm hoping that's everyone was expecting that for this afternoon. And as I say, it's going to be about an hour or so. So we'll have a little break in the middle once we've done the first section. There are some videos as well, so it's not just me talking. You'd be pleased to know. And if you want to ask any questions, just jump in. OK, so unless I hear otherwise, I'm assuming everyone's all right. OK. So before I start with the main screens here, what I just wanted to remind everybody is that when we talk about subject matter like this, adverse childhood experiences, stress, trauma, all of that stuff, we're not talking about other people. We're talking about you and people you know, people you work with, people in the room. So some of this might be a little bit challenging. So if you feel you need to dip out for a little bit, that's fine. If you also want to just kind of reflect on what you've known and ask some questions afterwards, that's fine as well, because it's going to be a lot of information to absorb in a very short space of time. But please remember, this is also something that many of us deal with day in, day out in our own families, in our own lives, and we're not immune to that. So if you do need to seek some additional support from your employer or from us or whatever, then please do. There's no issue with that. Our website at the ACE Hub has got some resources available, and there's some at the end of here, both nationally and I'm sure you've got some through your employment routes as well. So do think about yourselves, take care as we go through this, because it's, for some people this can be quite difficult if you've experienced some of this in your own lives. Okay. So what we first need to understand is thinking about stress and different kinds of stress that can occur during lives, and really understanding what impact that has. So we often talk about with adverse childhood experiences, and I'm not going to do this in detail with you today, is that the experiences themselves and the stress that's created actually has an impact on brain development. So in the first 1,000 days of life, even in pregnancy, when the baby's still in the womb, the experience of stress can actually affect the way the brain actually biologically develops. And that development takes place very rapidly over the first 2 years of life. So it's really the time when there is a maximum impact physically on a child's brain. So we remember that when we're thinking about the sorts of children that might be coming to Wales to seek sanctuary, and how they may have experienced in a very small time on the planet such extreme stress and a difficult environment that perhaps none of us can even contemplate. But it does have that formative effect, as well as obviously an emotional response, even with children that are not yet able to articulate or to speak. So what we need to do initially is just to understand more what this stress is and the different types of it. So there is positive stress, of course, and that's something that we all have. It's normal, and it's a really healthy response to things that we may find stressful. And actually, it teaches us how to kind of manage life. So, for example, if you have a moment of excitement, so perhaps being a little bit nervous, standing up, talking to people, I don't know what it is, just something that's really kind of gets your heart racing, increases your hormones, gets you kind of a little bit kind of more fired up, and then that's positive stress, because if you're able to channel that, you're able to perhaps deliver perhaps more energetic performance, or it teaches you to touch fire is not a good thing to do. So those sorts of things happen all the time, particularly in childhood development, but to all of us, and that is perfectly normal. We have a mechanism for responding to that kind of stress that's useful and helpful. Then there's a stress that comes into our lives that we call tolerant stress. And this is about where the body's alert systems are activated to a much greater degree. So you have a longer, more lasting effect, and the difficulties that you're facing occur over a longer period of time. So these could be things such as a bereavement, or an injury that's affecting yourself or a family member, or something like, a natural disaster. There's something that's going on that's going to be going on for longer. And if this activation of this more tolerant stress is time limited, so you have things like adults who support a child, and then there are things that perhaps we can do to recover from the effects of that stress, then that's something that is a shorter period and we can move on from. So those are the sorts of things that some of us will have experienced, I think, but it is time limited. The point is that it ends, and then you can return back to perhaps a less stressful environment. And then the third type is toxic stress. And this is when you have a really prolonged period of adversity. So if you're physically abused over a number of years, if you have emotional abuse, family hardship, prolonged exposure, which can affect brain development, and other things. I mean, this is something that is in a heightened sense of it that goes on for a lot longer. And we call this toxic stress. And when that's experienced in childhood, we can see, as we say, the brain development is affected, other organ systems might be affected, and also that increased level of stress turns into some really kind of difficult impairments and disease, perhaps, into the adult years. So this is the sort of thing that we've got to be very aware of, particularly within the group that we are looking to support, because that level of prolonged exposure to something like emotional abuse, physical abuse, violence around them, many years of conflict, etc. That's the sort of thing that could be the thing that creates toxic stress in their lives. So here's a video to explain this.
The reality is that we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of anxiety to perform well. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming at us, we have release of adrenaline. We have release of a hormone that we call cortisol. We want to jump out of there, and adrenaline and cortisol are going to help us do that. So there's that good amount of stress. But if all day long you're feeling like a truck is coming at you, day after day after day, that's going to take a toll on the body.
So the kid next to them hits them, or the teacher reprimands them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, right? Literally what they're feeling, that activation is like there was a truck coming at them.
Okay, so it's important to remember here that although this depicts a child, and this is what we're trying to sort of demonstrate in terms of the impact of this sort of stress on childhood, that if you have had this experience, then this is something that people are coping with and dealing with much later in life. So this is not just about children. That's been a misperception that I've had a few times when delivering this. This is about understanding that things can happen in childhood that affect later on, but actually will still be happening into sort of adulthood as well. So hopefully that explains a little bit more what I've been trying to get across around the different types of stress. And when we look at what the response to that stress actually is, as I've already mentioned, there are, there's kind of like a pathway that you go through when you're exposed to stress. And if it's something that is a threat to you, so you have something that you're really frightened of, then the chemicals kick in, things start happening, and you get to that point where you're thinking about fighting or flighting or freezing or flopping or whatever the terminology is. But there's a number of things that might happen at that point which determine your reaction to that stress. And in normal circumstances, so say it was, I don't know, a very big spider landing on my nose, having made my decision to panic, then you come down into like, oh, thank goodness, exhausted from the experience, starting to recovery, and then you go back to the resting point. So that can be kind of like a normal response to any of that. But when you have something that's an exposure to chronic stress over a period of time, actually what you have here is an development of the life-preserving part of the brain. So you're constantly in a state of thinking, what do I need to do about this? Am I fighting? Am I flighting? What am I doing? And if you have adversity and adverse childhood experiences happening constantly at that point, you're stuck. You don't come down into that exhausted and recovery phase. You're constantly fighting or flighting. And that wear and tear on the body is something that we start to see. It's called allostatic load. You don't need to worry too much about that. But actually what it means is it's this constant stage of feeling like, you know, you're under threat, and that can have a physical and mental repercussion as you go on. And this is what happens when people are in that state of toxic stress. So what are the sorts of things we might expect to see from people who have been experiencing adversity, some of the things that we'll talk about in a minute? What are the sorts of responses we might see? And as I said, it's that sense of being always prepared to fight or flee, because you're constantly thinking what's going to happen or what's happening. People may come across as anxious or impulsive, perhaps disengaged, not willing to really kind of talk about what's going on, or just be part of any conversation. And in children and learners at school, you often see that perhaps they struggle a bit more with that learning. There is a bit of behaviour that's a bit concerning, so they might come across edgy or hot-tempered, and they often have a real difficulty building relationships because they've got that hypervigilance, that constant looking over their shoulder to try and mitigate what they think is going to happen to them. Because in the life that they may have had before they came to the UK, then that is a very real threat that they've been dealing with, and that doesn't just go away. So your trauma response remains with you, whatever the kind of the trigger for that response is. So I've used a lot of terminology that says ACEs, and I don't want to. I mean, this is more about trying to understand what it is that many people have experienced. So we won't spend too much time, as I say, going through all the definitions. But if we understand ACEs for the purposes of today and going forward as these stressful experiences that occur during childhood, directly harm a child. So, for example, sexual or physical abuse, or affect the environment they live in. So, for example, growing up in a house with domestic violence going on. That is the terminology we use to describe ACEs. So you'll understand that is something that happens in the home, largely in the environment in which people live. And that can happen to anyone. We talk about this in our population in Wales, but we can also apply these sorts of experiences to anyone, really. What we're interested in later on is what additional experiences might have been faced by the families that are coming to Wales. And the research that looks at ACEs usually talks about 10 types of childhood adversities. So these 10 are born out of research based largely in obesity studies. So when they were looking at the link between obesity and things that may have happened in childhood, those were the top 10 sort of things that had happened, and therefore form the basis of that research. So it doesn't mean that there are only 10, and it also doesn't mean that that there can't be others added to the list or talked about. So we understand those 10 from the research, and they're useful to help us to think about what the prevalence might be and what the impact might be, but there are a lot more. So what these are traumatic. They can increase the risk of negative outcomes. So don't worry about limiting it to the 10 that I'm going to show you. There's a whole range of things that could be included here. And here are just some examples of some of the things that we could be thinking about. And if you think about the people that are coming to Wales, they may be experiencing a lot of these. For example, poverty, financial insecurity, perhaps not having any friends, not just from peer rejection, but from losing friends and losing communities and relationships, possible experience of discrimination, certainly experience of some of these other things, particularly having to leave other relatives behind, and thinking about, what is it that they're going to be entering to. So there's a whole range of other things here that come into play that are not necessarily in the household or that 10 as discussed, but we really need to think about that this is what people are coping with. So the traditional kind of what are ACEs is often this sort of picture where you see an intergenerational impact of something like violence in the home or domestic abuse. So what this picture is trying to demonstrate is that here we have you know, a father obviously being abusive towards a child, and we can see how that then becomes something that is a learned behaviour, is normalised, is unchallenged, and then, you know, that child then becomes the perpetrator of that violence further on. So what we're thinking about here is about things that occur in childhood that then can be perpetuated in adulthood, and that's what we're trying to challenge and address. So in Wales, there's been a number of studies that have looked at this. If you're interested, I'll put all the links and stuff to surveys and research in the chat in the break, and so you can have a look in a bit more detail. But basically, what we did in Wales was to say we want to understand within our own population what this looks like. You know, what is people's experiences of ACEs, and how do we then learn from that to ensure that we can prevent them, mitigate them, and think about what it is that we need to do more on. But what this does do is help us to understand what we're talking about in terms of where we need to focus effort, but also what the impact of these ACEs might be. So the study themselves asked adults to remember what happened to them in childhood, and to then say, you know, let's look at the prevalence of that. So don't worry too much about the percentages here, because they might be completely irrelevant. In fact, some of them won't be even part of life for some of the people we're supporting. But if you included some of the different ACEs that I've just mentioned, the outcomes don't change significantly. So this is just telling us these are the questions that people were asked. These are the percentages of people who said, yeah, this is what happened to me in my childhood. As I said, the 10 ACEs that research looks at. Of more interest to us, and just to give you a sense of this, is that during that Welsh study, which again, you know, caveats around who was asked and all the rest of it, we found that, you know, at least 50% of you know, the people who were asked have one ACE, and then you can see the percentages that went up to 4 or more. Now, the only reason we're interested in that is because there are different outcomes potentially and different risk factors based on how many of these adversities you might be facing at any one time. So that's why we're looking at how many to understand what then might be the outcome for people. So what the studies found, that compared with people with absolutely no adverse childhood experiences, those with 4 or more are likely to be at increased risk. It's not a definite, there's absolutely no kind of deterministic element to this, but there is an increased risk. If you are suffering 4 or more adversities in your life, then you have more likelihood to perhaps become you know, addicted to substances, or to be involved in violence, or to, at the end there, be more likely to be in prison. So there are some real important outcomes for us to understand from preventing some of these ACEs, in terms of not only where people end up in terms of their health, but also some of the activities that they take part in. But what I think is really interesting, and something that we need to really consider for this group, is this increased risk around mental health and well-being. So when the questions were asked over the past 2 weeks, you know, how did you feel? Those who had 4 or more of the adversities, and that's just the 10, we didn't count the other ones, obviously, replied that, you know, well, responded that they were 3 times more likely to have never or rarely felt relaxed, never or fairly rarely felt close to other people, been thinking clearly. And one of the things that I think is, you know, really quite sort of touching and devastating about this slide is that the last one, where it says 6 times more likely to never or rarely felt useful. Some of these things we really need to kind of think about, because it's not just the physical or the behavioural outcomes of adversity that we see. It's actually real increased risk to mental health and well-being. And these are the sorts of things that we might see more prevalent in our group that are coming to Wales. So the risk here can also lead to an increased risk of things around disease and health service use, which is obviously interesting to some of us who work in the health service, but actually it makes that point, doesn't it, that there is a link here between health and using public services, and also making sure that we don't separate out physical health and mental health. So some of the things that were found with those that had 4 or more of these ACEs were that they were more likely to develop diabetes, type 2, more likely to develop heart disease, more likely to develop respiratory disease, And then we see more frequent visits to the GP, or going to A&E, or staying in a hospital overnight. So this slide is really about understanding those health harming outcomes, and then the outcomes of that behaviour more to the point, but also the fact that there is a huge cost implication of some of this stuff as well. So we're thinking there about not only preventing it because we want to prevent people becoming chronically unwell, but also we want to ensure that we're trying to manage the use of public services more effectively. And as I said, I mean, one of the things that people sometimes misunderstand is that when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, I've had a couple of questions back from people. Well, I don't support children. I don't do anything with children. But the point is that if you've had adversity in your childhood, then that is something that follows you across the life course. So as a result of that adversity, you may then have disrupted nervous or hormonal and immunal development. There may be social and emotional and learning problems. You may, as the previous slides just set out, adopt some of those health harming behaviours and then be more susceptible to some of the more chronic health conditions. And unfortunately, at the end, you may also die prematurely. So there's something here about understanding that the people that are coming to see us, the people who are in front of us, may have had and very likely to have had a childhood that has included quite a lot of adversity of lots of different types. So actually they may be in different parts of this life course, and what do we need to think about in terms of supporting them, because this is the sort of outcome that they are experiencing. But that was all a bit doom and gloom and all a bit, you know, this isn't great for anyone, but there are some things that we can really think about in terms of protective factors, as we call them. So what are the things that can take place across that life course that can get across the point, for a start, that healing can occur, and that we can really provide that safe, stable, nurturing relationship and other protective factors, and they are healing within themselves. So this is the kind of bit where I think all of us come in the sense that we may be now dealing and meeting with and supporting people who have already experienced adversity like we have never. We may be able to identify some of the things we know about, but we also will identify some things that we don't. But we have a real opportunity to promote that healing and to provide some of those relationships that can really make a difference. So what does that look like? So we talk about resilience quite a lot, and resilience really should be translated in this case, I think, to, you know, having the opportunities to build up the kind of coping strategies that you might need to overcome whatever it is that you have faced in life. So we're not saying that, you know, we're just trying to make people equipped to deal with a problem and not fixing the problem at root cause, but with something like an ongoing conflict for many years and other things that are really not within our control, where we need to focus our effort is making sure that there is the opportunity for people to be able to get the things that can help protect against some of those negative outcomes that I've just talked about. And there are 4 key tenets to this. These are the key things that we can really think about helping people to be able to deal better with what they've experienced. So 1 or more caring child or adult relationship in their lives, being equipped to manage some of that behaviour and emotions. So what support do people need to be able to deal with how their experience has made them feel, feeling that they can overcome hardship and got a sense of guiding destiny. So in all the chaos, you know, how do we promote that feeling that, you know, you can change your life, that things will be better? And then being involved and connected to the community in particular, but feeling part of something, and feeling that, you know, that there is that support around you, whether that's at a community level, whether that's within the community that you know, that the housing that you're working on provides. You know, there are lots of ways of looking at this, but those are the 4 key areas that we think are the most important in terms of putting in those factors that guard against the more negative outcomes of the adversity, if we've been unable to prevent that adversity from happening in the first place. So these building blocks, as we call them, is that ability to adapt well in the face of adversity. And in my experience, and I don't know if others agree, that often people who come here to seek sanctuary, either through you know, crossing Europe or whatever method they take, but also through the various programmes, actually show often a very strong sense of not only resilience, but courage, bravery, the ability to adapt to adversities that many of us, as I say, will never have to experience. So what we're not talking about here is a bunch of helpless, agencyless people. And actually, there's a lot of strengths that can be built upon within this community. So that ability to adapt well, the ability to cope, but also having at least a relationship with one trusted adult, particularly during childhood. So we need to think about the children that are within some of these family units. Do they have that trusted adult? Is it there? That's really important. And if they don't, how do we encourage or support that relationship to take place? And then when we're thinking about preventing and mitigating and tackling adverse childhood experiences, we really kind of look at it in three different approaches that come together. So the first one, as I said, is stopping it from happening in the first place, thinking about policy, thinking about early interventions, perhaps through pregnancy period, prioritising parents for treatment when they themselves are struggling perhaps with adversities and the outcomes of those in adulthood. So that ability to really think about how do we stop this from happening in the first place. With the group that we've got, some will have experienced a high level of adversity that we won't be able to do anything to stop. It's already happened. And of course, that means that we are focusing our efforts on thinking about recognising those risks and intervening where we can. But also there may be some of the things that haven't yet happened that there is a risk of. So as I'll talk about in a minute, the families that are coming to us from Afghanistan, there is a particular concern around the treatment of women, particular concern around how the family environment recognises violence and other things. So whilst they are here and in that family unit, we need to think about what are the things that may actually be of higher risk to these groups, and what could we potentially be thinking about in that space. So it's not just a case of saying, oh, it all happened in Afghanistan, so therefore there's nothing we can do. There are actually things that I think will be occurring within these families that we need to be alive to and need to understand and think about what our role is in recognising what those issues might be. So when we're getting to the point of understanding that there might be an issue, then we need to think about, well, what's the best intervention for that family? And that's when we start getting into some of the thinking around those interventions, where you might refer people to, how we might involve services to make sure we've got the best outcome for them. Why is this important, and what is it? So we're not suggesting that everyone has to be expert specialists, mental health specialists. We're not. None of us are, or some of you might be, but certainly, in Maine, the people that are working with people day in, day out are doing roles and jobs that don't require them to have psychology degrees or medically trained or anything like that. So understanding what it is that we're talking about, that this impact of adversity can affect everybody, is the first kind of point here. So being informed that this is something that the person in front of you may have experienced, and that we understand the possible impact of that. And then on the other side of it, thinking about, well, what impact can you have as an individual in responding to that, and how do we recognise, and what can we do? And thinking about, obviously, what's happened to the people, what are the root causes, and not just treating what's in front of you. So, for example, if you see somebody who's just a bit angry and a bit shouty and looking really on edge, is that just because they're having a bad day, or is it because there might be something much more underlying than that we need to be concerned about and thinking about supporting? And in order to do that, we need to think about the world from other people's perspectives. So this is really rooted in showing compassion, kindness, listening. All of these things are protective factors in themselves for people who've experienced adversity. So making that link between the physical and the mental health, recognising those signs and symptoms of adverse childhood experiences, and then actively working with people to try and address what they might be. And that's where I think, there's going to be some really kind of strength in our partnership working and supporting each other to say, what is it for this group that we really need to be thinking about, and what is the things that they need more access to or support that they might need. So it might not be something that you can actually do yourself. It might be that we need to work with other partners to facilitate whatever support is needed. But the key is that everybody has a role to recognise that somebody might have experienced this level of ACE and trauma, and therefore may need, just some kindness and compassion and support in identifying what they might need to help them. So having that trusted relationship with at least one adult is, we think, is really essential in thinking about that resilience and counteracting some of the negative effects of adverse childhood experiences, but also promoting that sense of self-care and thinking about how individuals and communities can help themselves to look after each other. So establishing safe places when we're working with people of all ages, genders and cultures, and even if you don't think they've had any experiences, which in this case is very unlikely, but making sure that those safe spaces are established so that you're able to create somewhere that everybody can be part of. And then, as I'll talk about in just a second, thinking about principles of trauma-informed practice and how you put them in place, reflecting alongside your, whatever it is that you do in your role. How can you bring that in? So just quickly, before we have a little break and any questions, when we talk about trauma-informed practice, and some of you may have heard some of this being bandied around quite a lot recently, what we actually mean is thinking about how we kind of get a way of communities, organisations, individuals taking action on the adversity that we know about. So we become informed about that trauma, recognising those experiences, or possibly for anybody, and then incorporating that knowledge and ACEs and trauma into everything that we do. So we take an account of that individual's early life experiences. So basically, this is what it's about. We're just recognising that people might have experienced trauma and adversity, and recognising that we need to be thinking about that as we work with them. So one of the key elements of this is really understanding the importance of safety and ensuring that situations and environments are available where people feel emotionally, physically, spiritually and culturally safe. So establishing safe places is really important to building those relationships. So we need to think about what particularly for this group would make them feel unsafe. And in terms of perhaps some of the things that they may start to experience from living in this country, what is the sorts of environments that we need to be considering with that? And then there's something here about the ability to offer choice and to give the people that we're trying to support some control, because that's part of the healing process, and it really helps to avoid further re-traumatization. So by this, we're trying to sort of advocate for, if you're asking somebody to do something, you need to set it out in a way that they almost have a decision-making kind of capacity in saying, well, you could do this, but also you could do this, and this would be what would be the result of doing that. So bringing them into the conversation, and that enables them to feel like they have a little bit more control over what's going on and where life is taking them. And then there's the bit about collaboration and thinking about how we can be really inclusive in making those opportunities come about for that shared decision making to take place, and also to say, well, how am I doing? How does it feel for you? What is it that we're experiencing together, and how can that be improved? So there's a real sense of collaboration in terms of the work that we would do. So this is a really important tenet of being trauma informed in your approach, because you're not trying to do something to people. This is about taking them with you and working together in order to reach where you need to get to. And there is also the kind of, as I said before, the opportunity must be taken where possible to really think about what are the strengths that people around us bring to this. So there's a lot that's positive around bringing people, allowing people to be part of our communities, people just being part of our communities, and actually being able to recognise what those strengths are, and then creating those opportunities for individuals to kind of realise their potential and to build on those strengths. So really thinking about what is it that the people in front of us, around us, that we're collaborating with and we're working with are bringing to the table, and helping them to really maximise that. Then trust. And this is probably the one that sort of stands out in most of the conversations around how you build those relationships, how you are clear in terms of what's being asked for, consistent in the approach, ensuring that those boundaries are understood, but then building that trust so that we're able to create a sense of all the safety, empowerment, collaboration, all of that that comes with it. And that's based, again, rooted in kindness and compassion, thinking about their experience, thinking about what may be the things that make them feel unsafe, and also that cultural understanding of what they've been through and where they've come from, and how we can get a better understanding of that through them in order to build that trust and to work going forward. So that's said very simply, that's the kind of central aspects of what being trauma informed means. And everybody can do it. It's not something that you have to be trained in necessarily. It's not something that you have to have any qualifications for. It's about thinking around, who am I talking to, and how their experience might have shaped what they're presenting in front of me. So I'm going to pause there before we move on to the next one and come out of this screen so I can see people. So has anybody got any questions? Are we all going to have a little break? Was that an overload of information?
A break could be useful, but that's great.
Yeah, just really helpful, Jo. They're really comprehensive.
Okay, thank you both. Right, so if we say 5 minutes, if that's all right, go and grab a cuppa or whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back for a shorter bit on the specific experience of people seeking sanctuary. Okay?
Perfect. Thanks, Jo.
Alpha wasn't on mute. I think people are starting to come back.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Okay. So, anyone thought of any questions? I put some things in the chat if people want to have a look at some of the reports and things that I mentioned earlier. So the links are all there. Tom, you sounded like you were going to say something and changed your mind.
I couldn't think of a sensible question to ask at the moment, Joe, but
Fair enough.
yeah, I'm sure something will occur.
Okay, so if everyone's happy, then I'll keep going. And we'll do this next section, and then that'll leave, I think, some time for any questions that you might have thought of by the end. But hopefully it'll be about 20 minutes now, just to manage your expectations of the time. Right, let's see if we can get back to where I was. Okay. Oh, hang on. Whiz through it now. So just for this last section, we're just going to think a little bit more about the particular experiences that some of the families coming to us in Wales will have had, but also to be mindful of the fact that this is not, something that's new to us. Actually, that we've been thinking about what is the broader experience of adversity of refugee and asylum seeking families for some time in Wales, and that's really important because I think we're one of the few parts of the UK that really are trying to understand this. So whilst we're talking about a particular group here, just be mindful of actually this applies to much broader people that come here to seek sanctuary. So here's a quick video. It's quite long, but I think it just sets the scene for us. Someone's just asked if the sound is turned off. Hang on a second then. Oh dear. Right. Try again. Sorry, everybody. Right, see if we can. There must be an easier way to do this, but I've yet to find Teams. It does help with this. Right, fingers crossed. I'm relying on Tom to indicate whether or not there's sound this time. So thumbs up, Tom, if you can hear in a second. Should be a little bit of music.
Sorry, Joe, nothing yet.
No. Right, I'll try one more time and then. No.
It is subtitled though.
It is subtitles, but you do hear their voices. Right. We'll try one more time. If not, then we'll move on. Otherwise, it's going to be a. So sound is on. That's on. And then I'll see if I can. So you hear me clicking, can't you? Frantically.
اینقدر میترسیدم از همه چی. آمدیم در کوها تا زانوی ما پایای ما یخ زده بود. اصلا نمیتونستم راه برم. نفسم بالا نمی اومد. فکر میکردم همینجا میمیرم. رحت ودعت رفقاتي، اجا وقفنا الجيش السوري، قلت لهم عنا شهيد بالشو اسمه، لأنه صغير شايفيني صغير لحسدوني.
The big guns that I had, I've never had before. They were looting of people's properties, killing, raping, burning of houses. All this I witnessed with my eyes.
پدر و مادر ندارم. مادرم 6 سال قبل فوت کرده. اندازه یک آدم 25-26 ساله کار میکنه. با خوابم هم همچین چیزا رو فکر نمیکردم که همچین چیزا و همچین اتفاقا پیش میفته.
Desde que me vio a mí dijo que él me llevaba hambre a mí, dijo. A esta chinita le voy a ver el ojo, dijo. Y cuando me quedé adentro venía él con otro muchacho y incluso los dos abusaron de mí.
نحن بس وصلنا للمياه الإقليمية وقف البلم ما عاد اشتغل. وقتها هاج البحر وصارت تشتي علينا المطر كتير. متغيرة كتير كتير كتير، ما عم بثق بحدا. إنه كيف يعني الواحد إنه أول شي الغربة بتقسي القلب. الغربة بتقسي القلب.
ከብኔሩን ዘጋጠመና ችግር ኣብ ሊብያ 4 ወርሒ ኮፍ ኢልና ተምሰጨዊና ገለ ታይሞት ገብራ አማራጭ የለ ساعة مراسم
جبت معي لعبة بس ضاعت دبدوب ولا ددو أعطوني يا رفقاتي بالمدرسة ضيعته وإحنا عم نتهرب ضيعته بالماي كان في طين كتير بالأرض وقع بالماي ما عاد شفته كانت تحكي I love you وهيك شغلات بعدين أهلي قنعوني عشان مستقبلك سافر وإحنا بنلحقك بعدين إن شاء الله
There we go. Thank goodness for that. So what I just want you to do is hold in mind what that was left us with, really. I can't move it forward. Hang on. So some of the stories you heard there were stories of people who have made their own way to the UK or made their own way to safety, wherever that might be. But the relevance really is thinking about those children and their voices and what does that mean for the rest of their lives. And the one that sticks with me particularly is the point there where the little girl is told that you are our future, you are the adults. I mean, these are 12-year-olds and you know, that sort of age group. So just bear in mind what you've just heard as we go through the next few slides, because we're not going to spend too much time talking about some of that, but I think it just brings it to life a little bit. So I'm glad finally the sound happened. Sorry for ineptitude on computers. Okay, so just wanted to start with just a really quick slide on gender-based violence, because one of the things that we know from the research that was done by the UN, by WHO, by others, is that this is a really prevalent form of violence for people coming from Afghanistan. So just as a kind of a really quick overview of the background, it basically refers to violence directed at an individual based on gender norms or unequal power relationships ascribed by society. So, for example, because you are a woman, not because of anything else, because you are a certain faith, because you are. So, you know, in terms of gender-based violence, it's very much based on that fact that because of your gender, that's why you are perpetrated against. And what we're talking about here, it can also, include emotional or psychological violence as well. It's not just physical harm. So we need to think about how people are made to feel by being threatened by violence, by being coerced, some of the coercive control stuff where people are basically said this will happen to you if you don't do this, and then some of the things that happen around taking people's liberty away is a form of violence against women. So it's not just what you might see presented in front of you in terms of a scar or a bruise or something that you can actually see, and we know that this is the experience of women and girls across Afghanistan. So this is something that we will see and we do need to understand. It is a term that's used most often to describe men's violence against women and girls, but we mustn't forget as well, and particularly during conflict, that it can also include violence against men and boys, because that is often a way of demasculating people. It can be based on their sexual orientation and identity. So it's not something that's necessarily just a kind of binary, because you're a woman, because you're a man, this, that, and the other. There's the whole complexity to this that we also really need to understand. That's a whole nother training session, but I couldn't start this without putting that context in, because for this group, I think this is something that we really need to think about. And we have been doing some work in Wales on this, which again I'll put in the chat function if anyone's interested in having a bit more of a look at it. So the Uncharted Territory Review that's just been published is a review of a report that was done 2013, I think, so quite a long time ago, where we tried to understand what the sort of experience was of women and girls who came to Wales who were migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, and really trying to think of what are the things that we need to understand better to ensure that they get the support they need, and really understanding the prevalence of this form of violence and how many women and girls come into Wales it might affect. So, we know at a global level, 1 in 3 women experience this in their lifetime, but we really need to hone in, I think, on what are the experience of women coming from Afghanistan and potentially of girls and children. So draw your attention to a report that was done in 2015, collaboration between WHO and a number of other agencies that were trying to collect data on the ground. And I'll just pull out these 2 things that really stood out for me. So almost 90% of women in Afghanistan at that time had experienced at least one form of domestic violence. 17% experienced sexual violence and 52% had experienced physical violence. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they've experienced it with the partner that they come to the UK with, but that statistic suggests that there is an experience of domestic violence in most women's lives within their families and whatever. So we really need to think about this as something that only 10% of women haven't experienced rather than the other way around. And this for me as well is something that we really need to also consider, was that again in 2015, when women were asked, and they were aged between 15 and 49, and you can see where all this data came from if you're interested in the report, of that group that were asked, 92% believe that a husband is justified in beating his wife. So here we have a group that may not even think that what's happening to them is remotely wrong or out of the ordinary, or is something that is just what happens. So without going into too much detail, again, these are the sorts of questions we need to ask ourselves. What is the support needs of people coming here? What is their experience? How do we best understand that, and where do we need to ask for additional help? Because I think for this group, we're going to see these sorts of experiences being some of the most dominant for women and girls in particular, and then put that in the context of all the things I've just talked about, the ongoing conflict, the experiences that we're seeing happening in households, that it doesn't matter which community you're from, they're still happening, and how that all comes together in terms of our understanding of this group. So why is it important to think about ACEs slightly differently within asylum seeking and refugee populations? So one of the things that we were thinking about when we started to look at this in more detail was that the better our understanding of adverse childhood experiences and their longer term impacts amongst people coming here to seek sanctuary or people who are brought here to resettle, is that the better able we're then to provide the support that these people need to lead happy, healthy and productive lives, because that's the outcome that we're all looking for in terms of ensuring that people have the opportunities that they are afforded by coming to Wales. So we'd done a piece of research last year that looked particularly at the literature around adverse childhood experiences within child refugee and asylum seeking populations. And I think some of the learning from that is just important for us here to understand today. And one of the things is, regardless of the fact that we've understood from what we've just heard and from the kind of conversation we've had earlier, that there are much wider adversities that are experienced by this group. One of the key aspects is that there are additional adverse childhood experiences that happen before they leave the country that they call home, on the journey to the UK, and then on arrival to the UK. We'll use the UK in this instance, but this actually, the research looked at all countries that people were fleeing to for safety. So some of these additional ones, for example, in the country that is their home country, there is a prevalence of things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse within places that we regard as being safer in the UK. So, for example, at school, or within the community, or by people who are in authority. And I think that's really important to recognise that, people that we might or may not, depending on your point of view and your own experience, but we would hope would be a more trusted environment, such as a school, or such as reporting to a doctor, say, would be something that others might find really problematic because of the experience that they've had. Then there's this broad kind of witnessing of violence towards others, particularly if you're coming from an area which has experienced conflict and violence for many years, which this group will have done. So seeing things happen to other people have a real, even if it hasn't happened to you, has a very detrimental effect on mental health and on others, and particularly if it's within the family or whatever. So seeing that over a prolonged period of time, experience of bombings, experience of destruction of home, that's something that's come out a lot. You know, everything around has kind of fallen apart, but it was the house being destroyed and everything in it that has been deeply affected people. Actually having to commit acts of violence yourself in order to preserve life or to survive or to just be, you know, prevent yourself being have a violence act committed against you by authorities, for example. So sometimes we don't think about, you know, that's a kind of coerced acts of violence that can live with people for a long time. The experience of imprisonment or abduction, and then a severe deprivation of basic necessities, basic, you know, what we wouldn't even consider, you know, in terms of deprivation of needs. So that's the kind of experience before migration, and often in many cases why people leave. Then we have, not so much in this case, because I'd hope that the journey here would be something that wouldn't involve any of these things, of course, but we don't know what the experience was like at the airport. We don't know what happens in the preceding weeks. There may have been things that kind of fit within this bit, but in terms of people who come to Wales to seek sanctuary, often they will have had to travel through other countries. Often they will have used smugglers or traffickers to facilitate the journey. Different immigration systems actually have different levels of violence or abuse within them. And, you know, the experience of being in a refugee camp can also expose particularly children to sexual abuse, to emotional and physical abuse, all of that. So there's a whole thing going on there that's part of the journey from where you're feeling unsafe to where you hope to be safe, that needs to be thought about within this as well. And then coming to wherever people are either claiming asylum or seeking sanctuary or being resettled, there are still some problems within the systems within these countries. So here we're looking then about, you know, how does it feel to be part of a community in Wales? How does it feel to be trying to access systems? How does that either traumatize or re-traumatize somebody who's been through lots of different experiences in coming to the UK? So there's three levels here that we need to think about. So on the left-hand side is the kind of 10, but on the right-hand side is all the additional stuff that this group may have experienced. And what does that mean in terms of impact, and what does it cause? So the research itself identified a number of areas that we would need to think about. So this experience, whether it's, you know, all three stages or whether it's just the first and the last stage, or however way you want to look at it, there are impacts on families, particularly on parenting and on the risk of further adverse childhood experiences. So actually one of the things that kind of disrupts things a lot is that family functioning. So if you have poor mental health in the terms of the parents, that can then have an impact on the children. We're also changing family roles, which makes me think in that video of, you know, that the adult responsibility of a child, you know, that often children pick up the language a lot more quickly, obviously being in school, another access, and just being able to do that. So therefore they are often then the ones that have to translate, or they might have to look at documents or answer questions that are very adult conversations. And we've seen examples of this, particularly in trying to articulate particular health needs, or, you know, trying to navigate some of the systems. So some of the children are actually being placed in very much what we would regard as an adult role, and having to have those adult conversations. And that then leads to a little bit of struggle around differences in those acculturation rates. So if you've got children who are learning the language quicker, being able to make friends at school, developing a community, the older people in the family may find that a lot more difficult because they're not perhaps able to speak the language as quickly, find it difficult to learn English or Welsh, don't have access to that immediate community of a learning environment, may actually find it difficult if, for example, they've been used to many years of not being able to go out unaccompanied. So if you're an older Afghan woman, how much experience have you had of independence, of navigating, you know, quite simple kind of things that we would regard simple, but actually trying to find your way around Cardiff, for example. So there's that difference can sometimes cause some issues that we might need to contemplate. Changes in children's behaviour, as I said, we can see some of this sort of manifesting, that stress, that family tension can be borne out in children either becoming more withdrawn or perhaps becoming more agitated. So that change of behaviour, whatever it is, might be the impact of some of this. And then the overall concern about how safe are we? How safe are we as a family? How safe are my children? How safe are, all of this? Actually, that as a kind of environment to be in can exacerbate some of the things that might put people at risk of further adversity. So if you think about what some of those household ones are, verbal abuse, getting quite angry, getting frustrated at the situation, trying to find a way through it, actually could manifest in shouting at children or being in an environment where that takes place. So some of this kind of environmental concern around safety can impact on all of that. And then in terms of health, what we see from the research is that actually, particularly young refugees settling in European countries, they're thought to be affected quite a lot around their mental health. I struggle, it's a very medical thing and I'm not a medical person, the use of the word disorder. I think we need to think about, people having very normal reaction to extreme adversity that they faced. They're not necessarily needing to be diagnosed with a disorder. It is perfectly normal to have a reaction to witnessing violence or to any of the things that we've just talked about. But a third of young refugees actually have been diagnosed with some form of mental ill health that you can medically label in that way. And some of the health problems, as I say, are things around physical health that are maybe linked to that mental health. They come hand in hand, as I said, but also injuries sustained or perhaps sexually transmitted infections. When we think about some of the forms of violence that people have experienced, they also impact, the adversity they faced impact on their health in a physical sense. And then we see some of the kind of manifestations of this that are linked to perhaps poor mental health, but also affecting some of that academic achievements. So not doing quite so well in school, not doing quite so well in trying to taking forward their ambitions. So not only can it affect children, you can start to see that affect adults, in terms of not being able, and many not potentially from the group that's being resettled, but more generally in the refugee population, may not have had much access to education, may not have had much access to support or other things in the home country. So actually the level of academic attainment is much lower from the starting point. So that can also provide some detrimental impact on mental health. And then we see again, some of the manifestations of this being behaviour or what would be termed as behavioural problems, but actually they are just what we would normally expect to see when faced with this sort of adversity. But, and I think we need to start to think, as we've gone through all this, again, doom and gloom, there are some real positive impacts of some of these things. So coming out of adversity, there is often a stronger sense of meaning and direction. So understanding what you've come from and where you're going to, seeing that pathway that leads to safety, that leads to opportunity, that leads to being able to start a new life, that has come as a positive impact of what has gone before. And often we see a really strong sense of gratitude for whatever support is being offered. So we really need to think, that actually out of adversity often comes some really positive behaviours that we can build on. As I said, that strength, that kind of looking for how we can maximise potential. And some of the things that I do tend to focus on mental health because I do think that's one of the things that we really need to think more about. And I know there's a lot of work going on at the moment to look at that. But this cumulative effect of adverse experiences, whatever they might be, whether it's the 10, whether it's the much broader experience, that can then increase the risk of poor mental health. And that's something that I think is to be thought about. And often, if not so much in this case, but having children that have arrived here unaccompanied, even if they're in their sort of late teens, they're more likely to have had multiple of these experiences. And yet, where is that trusted adult? Where is that community? They are completely on their own. So there's a particular issue and a concern around children who arrive unaccompanied. There's often those sort of tensions or parental difficulties, or even one parent being here, the other one being left behind or trying to travel. So that separation is not necessarily through divorce or anything like that. It's through geographical location, and the impact that has is a particular one for this group. Low levels of social support, peer support for people who are unable to speak English or Welsh, peer support from people who have had the same experience. Some of this stuff is quite difficult, and actually being moved around a lot. makes that more difficult as well. So if you're in a system that houses you in one place and then moves you to another, you start to build up those relationships, you start to build up those communities, and then you moved on. And we know that that's something that we need to think about with this group. And then the last one, it's very nicely worded as perceived discrimination in host country, because that's what the literature says. But what we're talking about here is hate crime and racism, effectively. And what does that feel like? What's that experience feel for them? But also, what is it in reality in Wales? And I think that's something that when we talk about those kind of elements of trauma-informed practice and where we need to focus effort, let's not forget the cultural experience, the experience that some people have had based on maybe their faith, maybe on the colour of their skin, maybe on some of the other more social kind of factors, come to the UK or to Wales in the hope of safety, and then those sorts of experiences are reinforced once they arrive here. That can be, I think, really devastating, particularly for mental health. So those are the sorts of things that we really need to think about in that space. But before I finish, I think it's always good to try and think about what's the positive from all of this, particularly in a subject matter which is not that easy to be positive about. But there are also from this report a lot of factors that are associated with that resilience, with that ability to cope, which is what we're talking about with this use of the word, and growth following adverse childhood experiences. So even in the face of prolonged or severe adversity, many years of experiencing this in a number of different ways, with enough of the right sort of protective factors and support, people can recover, people can heal and maintain a healthy functioning environment. So what we see from recovery is that people have extremely positive thinking mindsets, looking to the long term, looking forward to the future, seeing as something different for themselves, understanding that life has meaning, and as a result of that, being very pro-social. So they're good people to be around, good people to support other people. And in the family context, and we're seeing this, some of these families are very large. They have positive attachments through generations. They have good family functioning, extended networks as a result of having a number of generations together, perhaps, and good parental mental health, because that is something that's been built as a result of we are going to look after our children. We're going to make sure that we as a family are able to manage this, and what do we need to do that? So that becomes then a positive experience. And then the larger social world, looking more widely, we see often, and I meet people all the time that provide that positive social experience, that good peer relationship. So looking to help others and be supportive of others, looking to provide safe and supportive schools that are really inclusive, involvement with faith or religious communities, and looking to the wider community for resources. All of those things are the things that are positively associated with overcoming that severe adversity, and then really being part of a community and contributing to it very positively. So just thinking, so as we close, we need to really consider that ongoing likelihood that this form of adversity, this wider form of adversity, is happening in host countries of anyone that comes here to seek sanctuary or is resettled. So we need to think about the broad range of things, what's happening in the family, what's happening in schools, what's happening in communities. It's not just that, let's think about the 10 things that the research has identified. So we also need to think about that way of being, that we need to recognise that this might be the experience of the people in front of them, and what do we do differently? What is that pathway of support, and what is our role as an individual within that? And thinking about, this is not just about someone here in front of you for this week. Actually, what we do now could have a really positive impact on their long-term health, and thinking about what those factors are that really promote that positive impact. How do we ensure that it's not just a short burst of here's a caring community, here's a trusted adult, here's something that'll help you help with your emotions, and then in a year's time all of that's gone and they're left with nothing. So we're trying to think about what is it that we can do to sustain that resilience building over time. And then the last, this is an activity, we won't do it, I'll leave it for you to go away and think about, but really this is about imagine it was you. So if you're thinking about the film we've just seen, thinking about some of the things I spoke about earlier, this is the experience that these people have had, hearing that sound of violence all the time, losing people have already left, some people are perhaps gone off to fight, you don't know, there's nothing left, there's no houses. What does that make you feel like? Because this is what people have brought with them, regardless of whether or not they have, a slightly more privileged position to be part of a resettlement scheme now, or whether they will find their own way here. Whatever it is, this is the experience that they've had, and how would you deal with it? And I think by doing that, it's a better way to understand that a lot of the reactions that you might see are perfectly normal. This is what anyone would have. It's just that we haven't experienced it ourselves. So trying to place ourselves in that position to be more compassionate and sympathetic to what we're seeing in front of us. And then just to finish, I think the whole point of this, and I hope it's been useful and at least thought-provoking, is to think about, from all the things that I've dashed through this afternoon, what is it that you can do within your service, within your organisation, to think about how you can do those things that form the trauma-informed practice elements. So create that safe space, think about collaboration, empowering, trusting, bringing people to a place where they can make choices. So what is it that your organisation could do a little bit more of? And it may be really simple things like creating an environment that perhaps doesn't feel like you're enclosed or boxed in, or it might be just asking the question, how are you doing today? You okay? And so it's, we're not talking about great big things here. We're talking about just being aware of humanity, I guess, and what you can do to help someone to navigate where they are and what they're doing. And also be aware of what you've learned today, if it was brand new, and how that might affect you personally, because this is something that, as I say, is not necessarily experienced by people over there. People have their own family experiences, and actually it might lead you to reflect a little bit more on your own life. So that's important. And as I said, there's people and places to help you if you need some more support with that. So think about how you cope with stress, how you cope with secondary trauma. You might be thinking, you might be hearing lots of stories, you might be understanding more about people's experience that you've never had to deal with this before, who've never had to think about it. So where will you go if you need a bit more support, and what role do you have in helping other people who are working with you if they're starting to feel some of the stress of doing this? Because one of the things that is, if we all kind of just worried about everybody else and not ourselves, then there wouldn't be anyone left because, we're all falling over. So think about yourself, worry about yourselves, get support for yourself, and then you'll be better able to support others. So here are just some national services. Mind mental health charity has a lot of tips for coping with pressure and stress, and there's a couple of others. But we've also got a whole range of resources on the ACE Support Hub. So I've put the website in the chat, but there you can get a lot of different resources for different things. And there's also the leaflet that was produced last year during COVID in 6 different languages for where people who are sanctuary seeking or refugees can get support as well. So I'll put that in the chat if people aren't familiar with that, but I'm sure, Tom, you've got that. So yeah, so there's a quick run through. All of this is on the website, so we won't worry too much about that. And I will come out of screen sharing, hopefully. And fingers crossed, I'm back in the room. So has anybody now got any questions, or you're just keen to leave, which is also fine.
I don't think I do, Joe. I did find that really interesting, though.
Good.
Slightly horrifying at the same time, looking at, all of the ACEs that our families inevitably would have experienced, plus new ones that they'll experience when they arrive in the UK. It does kind of doesn't give you much cause for optimism, but I think our experience of the Syrian program is that we see families going through the dips and we see the ups and the downs, but I think overall it's an upward trajectory, and we do see long-term improvement. But yeah, and interesting, the impact of sort of peer support as well. And I think Tim would reflect that some of the families that have progressed, the better are those that have offered support and help to other families going through the same things. So yeah, it is fascinating.
Thanks, Tom. Tim, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to, yes, in agreement with Tom, really. I think what this training session has done for me today is, Tom and I have worked together for the last 5 years plus. we have an approach, we've developed an approach and an understanding. It's quite clear that the cohort we're dealing with now on this scheme, their experience is going to be different. And for me, it's a case of going back to the basics, you know, what you've gone through with us today, wipe the slate clean and not carry any of the assumptions I might be carrying with me. You know, given the 5 years I've been working on a different scheme, my approach needs to be fresh and open-minded.
Thank you, Tim. I think that's a really important point, actually, in terms of, you know, what we think we know about the experience of Afghanistan, what people have had experience of that have arrived over many years, may be quite different to what's happening in the last 6 months to a year, or even the last few weeks. And I think some of the experiences will be perhaps completely different to anything that we've encountered before. But having said that, there is a lot of positive learning we can take from the Syrian resettlement experience, and, you know, for those of us that have been in and out of working around immigration for many years. I think the thing I hold on to in all of this is that there are so many good examples of where people have done really well, and actually have just needed being pointed in the right direction, or provided that support, or being kind of trusted to get on with it. And I think, you know, there's some really, let's hold on to the fact there's some such positive stories and such huge contributions made to our society from people that come here. That the harder stuff we need to do, but it's, you know, it's part of a bigger picture. So that's just my thought anyway. Okay, has anyone else got anything that they wanted to add? Oh, Adele.
Yes, hi. First of all, I want to say thank you, Joanna, for talking like an hour and a half. So thanks for that. And as I said, I'm from Egypt, so I kind of some of what you just said I knew about it, but it's too many information in terms of war, bombing, all this abuse they can suffer, and make me appreciate that emotional support is very important for these people, like to just be patient with them as much as we can. For me, as a tenant support worker, from today I will be more patient. I'm already patient. I will be more patient. I will provide them emotionally, which is very important after I understand these circumstances they have came from. And I hope everyone will help them as much as they can.
Oh, thank you. And I think that's a really nice way to sort of crystallize what I've tried to say in terms of, you know, there's all the technical stuff, isn't there? There's all the kind of medical stuff, there's all the other things, but actually this boils down to, you know, if you see something in front of you, just not leaping to that first kind of, oh, you know, what's this, but that having that patience, taking time to kind of just see what people need, I think is just so important. So thank you so much. That makes me feel really positive that you know the time we spent this afternoon has been really good. So thank you, Adele. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Right, well, I'll let you all go then, but if there's any further questions or anything else you need, then please do get in touch. Get in touch with me directly. I'm more than happy to answer anything as we go forward. I'm not sure how good the recording has been, but anyway, I'm happy to have another go if there's more interest. But for now, I hope you all take something away from that, and thank you ever so much for sticking it out to the end. And best wishes, and I hope that, you know, the next weeks and months and however long is a positive experience as far as it can be. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Then.
Thanks,
Okay.
Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Lovely to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.